Welcome to Plato's Cave for our December 28, 2014 broadcast. My name is Doris Motormouth and I am your Poseidon news anchor.
Okay, so I'm Harry Halpin from the World Wide Web Consortium, visiting researcher at Centre Pompidou, Erie. And in my sort of day job, like Smari, I work on technology issues. But what drives me, what interests me, and what makes myself, and I think many other technologists work on these issues is not what Norbert Wiener called gadget worshiping, not just a sheer love of the gadget, but actually a desire to understand the sort of philosophical and social and historical forces that shape our world today, of which technology is probably the most, I would say, dominant. I don't know if you want to do something now, or we switch off.
I'm Smart McCarthy. I do various things. None of it is really meaningful.
Best introduction ever. And so this lecture is going to be a lecture about the sort of foundations. It's called Societal Cybernetics. It will be a dual lecture between myself, who will provide, as I want to do, the sort of historical and philosophical background of how cybernetics became applied to society, and then Smari is going to inform you about the more sort of, I would say, developments coming from Stafford Beer and a certain branch of cybernetics and how they were applied to issues around democracy and voting and these sort of things today. So I'm going to begin. I was also trying to discover how is it that concepts from cybernetics began to be thought of as applicable to society, to change how politics and democracy work. It's very interesting. It's perhaps one of the most fundamental revolutions of our times, but it's not particularly well documented. Cybernetics itself was considered, as I'm sure everyone here is familiar with, this being one of the more interesting cybernetics research groups in the world. Cybernetics itself was considered about man and machine as a single, how would you say, system of command and communication, control and communication. And this was originally thought of in sort of very, I would say, simple terms. You know, Norbert Wiener's initial work around how do we use feedback loops to, for example, help shoot down ballistic missiles in World War II. However, during World War II, it did become clear that there was going to be a larger problem about how to rebuild society. During the 1940s, there was a very interesting symposium held called Science, Philosophy, and Religion. There was a series of symposiums, and this was during the 1942. It was kind of unclear who was actually going to win the Second World War. And it was hypothesized that there would be so much carnage and destruction and catastrophe after the end of the Second World War that there would be a sort of once-in-a-lifetime chance to rebuild society in the form of some sort of democratic ideal. However, it was not clear how to do that. So these think tanks were established where they were sort of saying, well, if we were going to rebuild society, how would we do it? And the two people who were invited, who kind of crossed over into cybernetics, were Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson. So, I got this out of order. I'm missing a slide, but regardless, Margaret Mead has this very good point where she states, as an anthropologist, that if we attempt to steer or control society, how is it that we, as the people who are programming society, are actually providing some measure of freedom or openness? I think it's a very good question. And interestingly enough, her husband responds, and this is, to my knowledge, the first sort of, this is 1942, this is the first sort of thinking of how can we conceptualize or operationalize freedom in terms of cybernetics. Bateson responds, Mead is saying perfectly clearly that there's a new shift in the emphasis or gestalt of our thinking will be setting human civilization forth into uncharted waters. We cannot know what manner of human beings will result from such a course. And are we, the scientists who he's talking to here, to reserve the techniques and the right to manipulate people as the privilege of a few, planning, goal-oriented, and power-hungry individuals to whom the instrumentality of science makes a natural appeal? Now that we have these techniques from social science, are we in cold blood going to treat people as things? What are we going to do with these things, these techniques? And then he states, we may be able to get a more definite, so it's a very good question, an operational definition of such habits as free will, if we ask about each, what sort of experimental learning context would we devise in order to inculcate this habit? How would we rig the maze or problem box so that an anthropomorphic rat shall obtain a repeated and reinforced impression of his own free will? So it's a very interesting quote. So he sort of said, yes, we have this problem with freedom. And if we're designing freedom, how is it that we're actually free? At the same point, he says, if we really want to understand freedom, we have to give it a scientific understanding. And we can imagine that the scientific definition of freedom is creating a form of technology in which people think they're free. So it's a very, I would say, disturbing beginning. But you can always see in the 1940s, this question of freedom in science and technology is already becoming, fascinating. And Wiener, later, who was the founder of cybernetics, at least from the American school, basically argued with Bateson that this was that applying cybernetics to society was fundamentally dangerous. And his argument was mathematical. His argument was that the main quantities affecting society are not only statistical, but because the runs of statistics which they are based on are excessively short. So when you take statistics about voting patterns or who likes who or who's eating what kind of food, the kinds of patterns that at least they were taking in the 1950s were based on surveys which were ran over incredibly short periods of time. So he argues because of this, we need long runs of statistics under essentially constant conditions. So he's sort of saying, well, look, this all ends up being incredibly important. In order to actually test to see if the scientific techniques, the cybernetic techniques that we're applying to society are bringing forth the kinds of results we want, we have to hold, just like any other good scientist, we have to hold the other conditions constant. We have to have an experimental condition and a control condition. And thus, he says, the human sciences are a very poor testing ground for new mathematical techniques. And furthermore, and then he brings up a point which is, I think, the main fear that we're seeing around social cybernetics. And he believes that the fear is the creation of a society of ants. And he says that I am convinced that a community of human beings is far more useful than a community of ants. And that the human being is condemned and restricted to perform the same functions over and over again. He will not even be a good ant, not to mention a good human being. So there's obviously, at the very birth of cybernetics itself, a debate over whether or not it can be applied to society. So on the one hand, a large amount of fear, well-grounded in the fact that humans are not easily controlled. Society is actually excessively complex. That it's not clear how you can tell if your technique is working, and maybe the only way you can make your technique work is to actually shape human beings themselves. And this is what's come back today. So there's many critics of the sort of the cybernization of society, the increased usage of techniques. I think one of the more intelligent ones is Bernard Stiegler, who says essentially, while we can talk about providing better access to the internet, without such a politics that takes these issues of freedom and autonomy central to this new cybernetic society, the inevitable destiny of digital brain is to find itself slowly but surely shortcutted by automata, right? Incapable of constituting a new form of society. That while automation is incredibly important, it makes digitization possible. It incommensurably, he's not arguing that it's not increasing our intelligence. He's saying it actually does make us more intelligent, but it also has the problem that under certain conditions, otherwise known as the conditions of late capitalism, it could shortcut our ability to actually genuinely obtain freedom, that we would be effectively, manipulated by sort of the manipulation of our memories, of our digital, of our habits, and all of these things into sort of being what Bernard fears is consumerist. And there was an interesting, so we had this large debate in the beginning of cybernetics, and eventually it sort of spins in multiple directions. Perhaps the most interesting direction was a direction in South America. Umberto Maturana, who was studying with Wiener, basically noticed that while one of the problems of cybernetics was this point, which I think you go over and second order cybernetics goes over, and Wiener and Maturana goes over in a sort of different way, that there was this presumed objectivity. But how can you, as a scientist, really stand outside of a system, including a social system, and attribute sort of meaning and information to it? And that Umberto Maturana, coming from a biological background, basically sort of said, well, any organism is a circular organization which sort of defines itself by its own continual reproduction. And we see echoes of this in notions of social reproduction from Marxism. We have this thought, and Nick was applied to legal systems and society in a sort of conservative manner by Nicholas Luhmann. But effectively, all the basis is that systems self-organize, and they self-organize for stability, but there's a crucial difference between Maturana and eventually Vrella's theory and classical cybernetics. While classical cybernetics aim for this homeostasis, a sort of preservation of negentropy, of the reverse entropy, this preservation of order against the decline and the waste and the transformation of things, the randomness and disorder, Maturana and Vrella says, well, look, that's not how living beings work. Living beings work in an environment which is naturally out of order, in which they can bring into order by sort of being off stasis and then entering structural couplings with other organisms, with other parts of the environment, and then bringing themselves back into stasis, and then eventually dying and falling apart. Now this concept of apoiesis is very interesting because eventually, and Smar will discuss this much more, influenced people to look at the concept of cybernetics, particularly Stafford Beer, was an English sort of management scientist, and figured out how can we apply them to society, to corporations. And eventually he was shipped over to Chile, where he created a system where he wanted to apply the system to the Chilean social democracy under Allende. And effectively, his vision, not Maturana, this is Beer, but sort of Maturana's students like Fernando Flores were helping Beer in this endeavor, and they were all sort of heavily influenced by cybernetics. But in the middle, you can imagine that if society was thought of as a cybernetic organism, you can imagine there's different autopoietic systems, right? There's a worker in the middle, individual, he belongs to another system, a crew, a workshop, a department, a firm, and you go all the way up to the whole nation and then possibly the global market, which is left out because this was the 70s. And that Stafford Beer felt you could conceive of all of society as a set of interlocking social organisms, and what you wanted to do is you wanted to figure out how you could control them by sort of subtly changing things and monitoring the feedback loops. And this would, at least for Allende, increase industrial production, which is what he needed as he was trying to socialize all the industries in Chile. The problem was, of course, how do you keep production up? So if you lose what Allende called the war of production, you would essentially let the economy collapse, and then socialism in Chile would be bankrupt. Of course, eventually, they were planning to build a sort of cybernetic control center, socialist internet as it's sometimes called Project Cinco or Cybersyn, for Chile. It never got completed and was destroyed by Allende, but it is sort of interesting. About Pinochet, that. And however, from this destruction, and I'll try to speed up and end, a number of interesting connections came out. The concepts of cybernetics, even though they did not work out in Chile to establish a sort of workers, self-managed democratic society, and that even though the fundamental objections of Wiener and other people were not, I would say, ever fully answered, Fernando Flores fled Pinochet, was dropped off at the airport in San Francisco by Amnesty International, picked up at the airport by happenchance, actually, by Terry Winograd, who was an artificial intelligence scientist. And, started talking the car, and then became a student, and then worked together for a few years. And then eventually established a new book, and a new sort of line of thought, where they sort of said, well, the problem with both cybernetics and artificial intelligence is that you're trying to basically, you're not understanding how systems can be repaired, and you're trying to replicate intelligence in terms of intelligent machines. Actually, what you want to do is you want to build environments for humans that increase their intelligence, and the way to do that is to sort of not pretend that you have a sort of rational Cartesian intelligence model based on representation going in the back of their head, but by sort of combining Maturana with Heidegger, which is a very interesting intellectual move. Basically sort of say, we don't even want to build stable systems. We want to look at when systems break down, and then build environments that allow us to dynamically repair the breakdown. And then by repairing these breakdowns and taking these breakdowns seriously and engineering around them, we can build even new and better kinds of cybernetic systems. About 10 years later, Google came out of Winograd students. You can sort of see that, that Winograd moved away from artificial intelligence, moved to design, sort of saying, well, if we want to prevent people having breakdowns in their machinery, want people to use their machinery properly, they should, have a clear screen, not encumbered like Yahoo, a bunch of stuff. And that this, I think that the present sort of cybernization of the world is to a large extent being brought about by Google. And the reason why I think Google's sort of successful at it, or at least let's say more successful than Project Cybersyn and other projects, it's not just pure historical contingency. It's also because they ultimately do have, unlike I would say most technology companies do, a pretty sophisticated political understanding of the world. It's not very sophisticated as some people's, but it's definitely exists, and they have a lot of power behind it. And so what Google is sort of saying, and there's a number of books that came out recently. New Digital Age is quite good. I'd also recommend the new management book, How Google Works, which explains how Google is looking, just like Stafford Beer, looking at how do we harness creativity, how do we harness intelligence in these sort of large firms, how do we use this to affect really wide-scale change, but also not have the firm spin out of control. How do we not have the firm collapse? And then how can we apply, in the new digital age, how can we apply the tools that we've learned from organizing Google to organizing society in general? And the main point they make is that and I think this is a very relevant point that was just hinted at after World War II, is that after World War II, the nation state eventually entered a state of decline and now a state of collapse. And the traditional Fordist corporation, after sort of compromise, has also had this collapse. And that this is sort of being replaced, this sort of centralized form of sovereign power, which is pre-cybernetic, is being replaced by a more diffuse form of cybernetic power. And for Google, this is a platform that, unlike a traditional corporation, which simply sells you things, a platform has a back and forth relationship with consumers and suppliers. It listens to them, it talks to them, makes them part of it. And that eventually, Google thinks that with enough information, and ability to crunch it, we can solve any of the social problems facing humanity. And that's a sort of metaphysical point, which I might return to later if I have more time. But I think what we're seeing is that we're seeing that these tools for change that were envisioned by Stafford Beer are now being essentially, if there's ever been a time for them, that time is now. So we're seeing that we had these large-scale social movements in 2011, Egypt, Spain, quite small but interesting in the United States as well. But they all eventually hit a wall, right? So they all encountered the same problems that actually the United States encountered at the end of World War II, which is, we've had a massive social collapse. Nation states are collapsing. People have lost all faith in government. How do we establish a new kind of governance where people do believe, where people do, ideally have actual autonomy and freedom. And how can we present the tools that allow people to reorganize society? And if those don't happen, and if we can't build those kinds of tools, then effectively these new forms of diffuse power, rather than being, I would say, liberatory, what is coming after the end of nation state is also new forms of diffuse power, which have, I would say, very, reactionary sort of ideological foundations. So you can see that there is, very heavy use of cybernetics and at least social media by, in a very sort of diffuse kind of transnational power by organizations like ISIS. We have to take that seriously. And at the same point, at the very historical moment when it's true, when we're facing this sort of epic crisis in the ability for our nation states to function, and as the cybernization of society is just sort of taking off, people feel that cybernetics and computer science are in general not fulfilling the purpose, that Silicon Valley is just producing sort of dumb apps, the Yo app, for example, right? And furthermore, the people who seem the most skilled at, while Stafford Beer imagined that we would put the worker at the center of this sort of cybernetic command and control structure, that it would be democratic and participatory. And what you're actually seeing is that there is a giant control structure, at least a surveillance structure being established, and it's not democratic participatory. In fact, no one until recently even knew about it, although many people suspected. So we have the National Security Agency revelations. And so we do see, and there's T on the back, is that we are seeing that throughout the world, as more and more people who are technologically skilled are skilled, let's say, in encountering these sort of periods of collapse. We're seeing more and more apps, these sort of tools for change being built. And that there's even a desire that if the nation state itself is collapsing, maybe the only way to establish some kind of freedom in the face of the perhaps ongoing, I would say, move towards a sort of completely lawless and camp-like sovereign order that we're moving towards, is to have a sort of Bill of Rights or Magna Carta built into the internet itself. So this is Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the web, this is Edward Snowden. And Edward Snowden makes a very interesting point, which I think hasn't been fully digested by most people. But he says, yes, I believe we need this sort of Magna Carta of the internet, sort of Bill of Rights, but we need to encode our values not just in writing, not just in an abstract statement, but into the structure of the internet, into the structure of the technologies themselves. And then there's some concepts about what that could be like. Tim, of course. Some of it's sort of very traditional, rights of free expression. Some of it, though, directly deals with internet, network neutrality, low cost, protection of private communication. But in general, I think we haven't, and I'm going to stop now, I'm going to hand off to Smari. We haven't actually resolved the problem that was brought up by Mead and Bateson at the dawn of cybernetics itself. We don't yet understand how to build, although Smari will attempt to explain some of his concepts on this to us, how to build social cybernetics in a way that can actually replace collapsing nation states. It's clear Google and some other companies have ambitions to do so. It's also pretty clear they haven't built the tools because it's not working right now very well. And at the same point, there is a real concern. I would like to end with this little point from Norbert Wiener's sort of last book, that we have to really understand if we're going to build tools for social change, tools for democracy, tools for freedom, how can we make sure that those tools don't end up being just another control mechanism to reduce, and what does it actually mean to have autonomy and freedom? Can we live with Bateson's operationalization of this as optimal learning environments? Or is there something deeper that we have to be able to articulate and understand when we're building these tools. And Norbert Wiener warned us that we have to be very careful in trusting our tools too much. That, and I'll just end with this, of the grand priests of power, there are many who regard with impatience the limitations of mankind, and in particular the limitation consisting in man's undependability and unpredictability. But what fuels this is the desire to avoid personal responsibility by placing responsibility elsewhere, on the machine, which a device which obviously can't understand the situation it's thrown into. And then Wiener points out that this was also the defense of Mr. Eichmann. So I just say we're at a very crucial, he was of course part of a larger machine, that we are of course in a situation where these types of machines are being called for and must be programmed within this generation. But if we do it wrong, and if we don't think it through, we will have to live with consequences which could be even worse than we possibly imagine. And now, with that happy note, let's move to Smari's take on this.
I'll just be skip forward another one. Okay, so actually, because that last bit reminded me of this statement that I can't remember who said, but it was, technology is not good nor bad, nor is it neutral. And you know, it's a good reminder of how technology basically tends to do what we want it to do, and often very exactly so, regardless of what we think about it. And it's kind of in that vein that in 1970, when Salvador Allende had just taken over the presidency in Chile and said, well, okay, you know, we need to build up our economy. It has been through some recessions, and the global price of copper, which is Chile's one of Chile's main exports, was in a slump, and they were like, okay, we need to do something new, something better, and I don't know exactly how it came about, but for some reason they contacted the British management at Madison Stafford Beer, who agreed to come over to Chile, and you know, he's a you know, big kind of happy Englishman, you know, with a big beard, and he shows up and goes, okay, you know, I've got an idea of how we can make things better. So he sits down with President Allende, and he draws a series of 5 boxes explaining the different levels of this idea. Where at the absolute center you have the workers who are providing information constantly to their factory about what the factory is supposed to be doing, and or what they are doing within the confines of the factory, and then this is passed up to kind of the factory whole, which then aggregates all of that information and then passes it up through this series of telex machines. And so, you know, thinking about this, this is basically, telexes are 1970s internet, and in a way, this idea was you know, an early idea of how to build an internet. And ultimately, when Pinochet took over, funded of course by the CIA, as is well known now, what America was essentially doing was destroying the internet so that they could build their internet, because they needed the global price of copper to go back down. It had gone up so much during the experimental 3 years that Project Cybersyn had been going on. But he continues drawing these boxes, going up to the municipalities, going up to the regions, and then finally he draws this 5th box and says, and this, compañero president, is you. To which Allende replied, at last, the people, you know, like, and it's unclear whether he was considering himself to be the people in a kind of Louis XIV sense, or whether he was thinking of himself just as a delegate for them. But so, you know, you can go on. So this is kind of explains part of it, and of course the worker is in there, and then you've got he actually did this on 2 levels. So one of them was kind of vertical through society, so the different management layers of society, municipalities, regions, etc. And then on the other hand, he also wanted to do it through different sectors and branches of different types of companies that were operating. And of course, in 1970, this was a kind of insanely ambitious idea to basically connect all of the companies in the country to some kind of like internet thing and have them communicate with each other on a constant, continuous basis. But there it was. So I'm not actually going to spend too much time talking about Safir or Severson, but rather reference his work and kind of the kinds of things that have been happening as a side effect of his work, both in kind of the questions of political organization and El Pueblo, but also in relation to, since Harry mentioned that I was involved with the pirate parties, into it, and then just questions about experimenting with democracy as a thing. This is actually a quote that, from a essay that Beer wrote called "Fanfare for Effective Freedom," which is, well, it was a speech that he gave, and generally reading through his stuff, his comments on the project, it was pretty obvious that he was absolutely a socialist and saw the kind of traditional model, the capitalist model of industrial functionality, to be somewhat against the idea of freedom for individuals. And so one of the kind of questions that was kind of neatly packed up by Kim Stanley Robinson is, if democracy and self-rule are the fundamentals, then why should people give up these rights when they enter the workplace? In politics, we fight like tigers for freedom, for the right to elect our leaders, for freedom of movement, choice of residence, choice of what work to pursue, control our lives, in short. But then we wake up in the morning and go to work and all these rights disappear. We no longer insist on them. And for most of the day, we return to feudalism. And, because once you have that kind of managerial structure in place and that kind of hierarchy, then there's a lot of weird implicit stuff that comes out of it. So, taking some of those thoughts, I was involved in founding the Icelandic Pirate Party in 2012, and we won 5% of the seats in the Icelandic Parliament in early 2013. And our platform was pretty much structured on the idea of access to information and self-determination. So that essentially comes down to increasing availability of information to increase the quality of decisions, so that people can make better decisions. They need more information. And then increasing direct participatory democracy, which increases the agency of the individuals within the system. And the kind of thesis was, if we do both of these things, then people can govern themselves effectively. But if either one of these is missing, which is the case in most democratic, or in countries that claim to be democratic today, then you don't have transparency and you don't have that kind of effectiveness. So at the end of the day, it really comes down to questions of authority and structure thereof, or which structures are most amenable to generating liberty and welfare. And so a viable structure of authority must necessarily yield requisite variety or eventually fail. And I'll get back to that thought a little bit later on, but another idea there is that perhaps the definition of a good government is one that you can safely ignore. So there's all sorts of protocols. Protocols are a good way of thinking about a lot of this stuff, because protocol is essentially just a language that we communicate with each other in. It's a way of exchanging information. And societies are operating on different types of protocols, but some of these are very explicit and some of them are very implicit. So Larry Lessig showed that there were 4 major categories of governance protocols: so law, norms, architecture, and markets. This was in one of Francis's papers referred to as so largely equivalent, so legal control, mutual monitoring, internalized restraint, and market mechanisms. So those aren't necessarily fully overlapping, but they do roughly the same thing. But laws are some of the more prominent mechanisms, and they they are the most readily amenable to being studied. It's very important that we don't overlook it, the other ones. For instance, I'm quite interested these days in just how much architecture is being used to manipulate how people behave. It's a fascinating thing, but it's very hard to study. So, but if we ask what is law, what is the law? Well, first off, it's a social software project, right? The product is a piece of software that runs on top of society and tells society how to function with regard to certain inputs. So the legal code base is open source in the sense that everybody can read it and potentially, make revisions. Although generally this isn't done by everybody, it's done by a small committee. So so there's like a committee of developers who are in republics, or you have some kind of dictators and their cronies in non-democratic countries who are essentially developing this legal code base. And actually, in some countries like the United Kingdom, the legal code is under copyright. In fact, crown copyright, which is a fascinating thing if you're interested in copyright law. But can you move on? Changing the legal code is something that is very tricky. If you mess it up, then the changes take effect immediately, and you can have all sorts of bugs that come up. So buggy code can lead to monopolies, dictatorships, revolutions, poverty, genocide, economic collapse, wars, whatever. But minor crashes are generally quite salvageable. So, but then you ask, okay, what is all this law going to do? Well, typically you have some kind of mechanism for accumulating taxes, pushing it through into some kind of governance structure, which then constructs or provides welfare, warfare, infrastructure, and extra structure. So extra structure including stuff like diplomacy and whatnot. But more kind of in a traditional sociology vein, government is seen as a regional monopoly of violence, which also means a regional monopoly on tax extraction. But nowadays, and historically, those rights were mostly around the issue of making eventual warlords rich and powerful, but more recently in history, there have been more and more infrastructural obligations put on governments, and they have to do more construction and management of infrastructure in order to be allowed to exist. And when coupled with the kind of economic realities of the nation state and capitalism kind of interacting, you tend to get a very centralized system that is actually relatively fragile. Its fragility comes up in things like 100th waves, where you've got big 70-year cycles on market behavior, and then you've got market crashes. I think the World Bank registered 168 individual market crashes between 1970 and 2011.
Not exactly a stable cybernetic system.
No, very, very prone to explosion. But on the other hand, people might say, okay, this system of governance is kind of crazy, but we have a lot of people. There are 7 billion people in the world, and a lot of complexity emerges. I mean, just the number of connections between people is roughly asymptotic to n squared. So that means that if you have 150 people, which is a relatively small and manageable number, referencing Dunbar, that comes out to 11,275, I think, connections between people, which is, you get a lot of combinatorial explosions. So, so perhaps because of this complexity, there is this tendency to, for authority to start to aggregate into hierarchical structures where the communication pathways are a lot simpler, and you can have these more simple and effective protocols of communication. But one must ask, was this intentional? Was this something, was hierarchical rule an objective of the political system, or is it just a side effect of how people have been governing? And of course, historically it was, and governance by venture warlords, which is a term from Eleanor Saeta, so venture warlords are the people in societies who essentially try to gain control for the purpose of creating some kind of new social structure and essentially define how the society functions. But historically it has been a norm, but hierarchical governance has never been a stated, explicit goal of democracy. On the contrary, democracy by the very term doesn't imply any hierarchy. But then the implementation details, coming back to periods of time when people had to actually ride horses into parliaments and have free time to do so, the realities had to kind of force people into that kind of into the structure, and so it's really a side effect of ineffectual systems design. People when they only had horses, that was the best we could do. But as Beer put it, that when a society fails to define its objectives, its consequent self-indulgence and freedom is met by a running tide of authoritarianism. So, and most of that is emerges in the form of things like institutions. So, institutionalization of whatever needs to be done is one of the kind of core tenets of modern societies. It keeps coming up again and again and again. And even Illich criticized this by suggesting that institutionalization leads people to confuse process with substance. So people start to confuse an education for learning, or medical attention for healthcare, and so on and so forth. But maybe individuals are a better measure, and at that point you get into these questions about agency. You can go on a little bit further. So deinstitutionalization basically moves agency back to people by distinguishing between the process and the substance. But institutions are very, very bad at interfacing or communicating directly with networks. So, for instance, when you've got these protest movements, one of the things that kept being said again and again during, for instance, the Occupy movement was, who is your leader? Who are we supposed to talk to? Who represents you? And the protest movements that kept saying, no, we don't have a leader. We're communicating as a network. And as a result, there was no communication pathway between them. And then comes this, what Eleanor Saeta and I called the wire hypothesis, referencing the TV show The Wire, which suggests that the limitation of each agent's scope of action contributes to the total societal scope. So effectively, when a person is incapable of doing something within the system, that inability translates into inability on a societal level. And that means that a society can only really change within the realm of what is considered possible with respect to existing agency. So this is one of the things that happens very frequently in societies where you see massive corruption in the form of bribery and stuff. You have people who could effectively just stop paying bribes, and you have people who could effectively stop receiving bribes, but if either one of them were to stop participating in the system, they lose their ability to function within the system. And that kind of leads to this kind of interesting corollary of the regulator theorem, which states that if a system is to govern another system, it needs to have at least as much variety as the system it's intending to govern. But governance cost, there is always cost to governance, or at least you can assume that there is always some cost. And what happens then is that the corollary comes out that if a governor is supposed to if a society or an organization is supposed to self-govern, then by definition, because it's the same thing, it has the same variety as itself, meaning that it can only self-govern if the organizational overhead is zero. And how does one accomplish that? The human body doesn't accomplish it, so we eventually die. How are we going to manage to self-organize societies without some kind of structure? Okay. So in complexity theory, you get this statement that every automata is equivalent to some kind of language. And if we recognize that institutions, just as in the diagram earlier, the government is a thing with fixed inputs and fixed outputs. It, of course, can do all sorts of weird things in the process of its functioning, but it is, for all intents and purposes, an automata. And that means that, according to the complexity theory concept, there is a language, which is to say a protocol, which is structurally equivalent to it. So most institutions could, be replaced in theory with some kind of formal, explicit peer-to-peer communication protocol. And actually, some institutions, such as schools, could be replaced with implicit or informal protocols that don't require like the explicit definition of language. But, go on. So there are actually in society two major explicit communication protocols that we use every day. You have money, which we use to communicate personal intent. I intend this for me. And it is a mesh topology network where there's high levels of liquidity and there's all sorts of interesting properties that you bake into a monetary system. And then you have votes, which have a star topology in terms of communications, and you have very, very low liquidity, but it's where you signal societal intent. I intend this for society. Both of these are really just ways for us to communicate in a formal, structured way. But most people would say that having availability of more money means that you can do more things. But it actually is a question of having good liquidity rather than having lots of money. So if you have billions of euros in bonds but can't free up the bonds to buy an ice cream, then your ability to function is somewhat artificially limited. However, if you've got, even if it's only 10 euros, you can probably buy an ice cream. And that kind of liquidity and fungibility comes in. But with votes, you get a completely opposite thing because you have no liquidity in the democratic process. The votes that you get one vote created by the government and handed out to you once every 4 years or thereabouts. And there is a legal requirement for you to invest it on a particular day on a relatively small set of things, and that's your total social intent capital for that period. And as we know from having observed politics, the return on investment is pretty bad. So modern democracy as a result looks pretty much like this. You have people who are interfacing with the entire political system through these parties, and carry on. In an example, you might have 2 seats that are being fought about, 4 candidates running, and the 57 voters who distribute themselves like so. Now, of course, only 2 guys are going to win, which means that 63% of the voters are getting it. Now, this is a first-past-the-post voting system, but just to understand, mostly when you're expressing political intent or political will, support for competing ideas tends to fall on the Lorentz curve. And if you carry on, so and the options on a Pareto distribution. So if you have, you normally calculate some kind of seat value, and in this case, this is a hypothetical thing where you have 3 seats in a first-past-the-post voting system. Then those 3 achieve the seat value, and the rest of the votes are essentially wasted. Now, and this is effectively in the previous example is as if 28 to 29 voters had chosen each winner, including the other candidates, which is a ludicrous system. Like, nobody would actually want this, and this is why there's been all sorts of innovation on different voting systems, such as single transferable vote, where the likelihood of votes being wasted in this way is reduced greatly. But effectively, modern representative democracy becomes a system where you are forced systematically to compromise early and compromise often. You're always throwing away more and more of your political intent. So some people suggest direct democracy as an alternative, and they go like, oh, okay, that's really good, but I don't have time to internalize and understand all of the nuances of VAT law or import tariffs or all of these things. And well, to a large degree, that's right. So in the traditional voting systems, a lot of people, or typically you get either yes or no, or you get to choose some kind of option, or you can just abstain or not participate at all. And but if we add the third option, where you can delegate your vote to any third party, you start to get lots of very interesting properties, especially if you allow transitivity within that. So you could do this on different levels. You could do this on a general or topical or per issue basis. So general being, I'm apolitical, I don't have any opinions, but I trust Harry, right? That would never happen, but it would
Probably
be,
a bad idea.
Yeah. But or topically, you're like, I know a fair bit about information technology. I know nothing about agriculture really, but I know people who do know things about agriculture. So maybe I'll trust them with my vote in that case. Or you can do it on a per issue basis, saying like I follow telecommunications law relatively well, but I just didn't manage to read that particular bill, and thankfully Harry read it, and I'm just going to trust him in this particular case. So dictatorship as a model is essentially what happens when everybody delegates to the same person. Now, in reality that would never happen, but it is effectively the same thing, just from a systemic perspective. And coercion comes into play there. But representative democracy is essentially the exact same thing, exact same model, except with a few more dictators. So you could say that representative democracy is a highly advanced form of dictatorship. But this here is a much more interesting system. So carry on. But there is a problem there. We've got that cycle. So those are people who are delegating in a circle, and we can't have that. So we must define it as a directed acyclic graph. Okay. Once we have that rule.
Page-check solves that problem.
What? Sorry?
Page-check.
Yes. Yeah. But they do it with a stability vector on they assume that the thing's a Markov chain. So we can't do that with this. But ultimately, the people who don't delegate end up deciding everything, and if you go on further, they decide with different voting power. So, so with this kind of, all of this stuff, I know it's been a bit of mishmash of different ideas, but putting all this together, we started this kind of discussion in Iceland back in 2008, which led to first the Shadow Parliament project, which was essentially just an idea of running a website which scraped all of the new law proposals from the Parliament and allowed people to vote on them. Now, of course, this didn't have any formal power or anything like that, which interestingly led us to the observation that people will not participate in systems unless they actually think that they're meaningful. It seems pretty obvious, but it did take a trial and error to actually discover that. And then at the same time, the Pirate parties were being created, and the Pirate Party in Germany took this idea and kind of ran with it their own way and started to use delegative democracy within their own party structure. And we thought that was a really good idea. The software they developed is really bad, like phenomenally shit. Sorry, but they did it, and it's been working to a certain degree. And then the Citizens Foundation in Iceland started Better Reykjavik, which doesn't have the delegation but has a lot of the other thinking in there. And then it expanded to Better Iceland. So Better Reykjavik actually is run by the City Council of Reykjavik, and they do actually pull the ideas in and allocate funds to them in various ways, and that's a bit of a long story, but and then they built your priorities as well. So that's just one foundation that I'm not actually even associated with, but friends of mine, and they're doing really interesting stuff. But then, coming back to beer, he says that liberty must be a computable function of effectiveness for any total system whose objectives are known. So, not knowing the objectives has been a pretty big problem with democracy for a long time. Partially because nobody really agrees what the objectives are, but also in the sense that there are all sorts of non-objectives that have been kind of just baked into it historically as kind of a side effect of having to use forces in the old days and having had pretty bad systems design. And then, but even if we do manage to nail down the objectives, then moving to a delegation model of liquid democracy, it implies computability, and that's the kind of nice result to get out of everything. But there are a bunch of open problems. One of which is that mapping, so nobody has actually gone and done the work of mapping the complexity classes of institutions. So, is the tax office a regular language? We don't know. It probably isn't. Anybody who's filed a tax return knows that it's probably Turing complete. But we need to actually understand the complexity classes of these institutions, and then we can establish a well-ordering and figure out which ones we can protocolize. Then we need some kind of general language of protocolization of executive processes. So a lot of stuff happens in society through this kind of fiat of let's just try something. We feel like we need a new university. Why do we need a university? Well, we need education. Okay, let's just build a process under which the goal is somehow attained without necessarily understanding what the elements of that structure actually are. So you get a lot of fuzziness. Then we don't have any boundary theorem for organizational overhead. So this is a very important one in terms of figuring out what the size of society can be. Robin Dunbar famously stated that it's 149, or well, most people say 150 because they haven't read his paper. But 150 is a number which is assumed before you have any technological additions into it. And I'm pretty certain that having seen how mass movements are organized on Twitter and Facebook and so on, that technology has the ability to artificially augment the number of people who can effectively collaborate in a society. But we don't know, we don't have a boundary theorem for how that works, nor how to do it at scale. We don't have any good tools for network institution interactions, meaning when protest movements such as Occupy decide that they want to communicate with the police about a rally that they're going to do in order to somehow help everybody out, that just doesn't happen, and we need better tools for that. And then one of the weird things that all of this kind of falls apart on is even if you manage to replace representative democracy with a system of direct democracy, mediated or otherwise, then what always happens is you get that, and you then replace all of the executive structures with protocols and how people communicate with each other, but jurisprudence is left behind, and unless we come up with a really good model for network jurisprudence, we're always going to have courts in the traditional sense. So, but otherwise, we have ideas for how we might be able to replace the legislature and the executive, and that's a good starting point. So, and all of this kind of follows quite naturally from projects like CyberSyn, although, of course, CyberSyn was economic primarily, and all of these experiments have been more in the political realm. But yeah, that's it. So, right.
So I think
Thank you for listening to Plato's Cave. See you tomorrow.